Let's continue our discussion about Descartes, especially in Meditations 2, because he raised something very interesting here, no, in this section where here in this section and let's look at this one. No, we're still on Meditations 2. To pursue Descartes' strategy to the next level, from the immovable, epistemically certain Archimedean point, the cogito, of his own existence, to epistemically certain beliefs about the existence of things outside himself. Descartes first attempts to establish a distinction between the degree of certainty afforded by two kinds of experiential belief. He begins with the mind's experience of itself, of the immediate experienced content of its own thoughts, as contrasted with sense experience of things that appear to exist outside of itself. Descartes accordingly proposes to prove that the mind is better knowable than the body. In a way, this conclusion is already available from the combined force of the evil demon hypothesis and the cogito sum. Descartes now makes the implication explicit. He brings us into his table as he examines an ordinary concept, a piece of wax. Perhaps from a desktop table candle or desktop candle, perhaps, or a piece of sealing wax. He reflects on what he can believe about the wax and how we come to believe it, and the source of our justification that in fact there is a wax. Uh, the passage in the Meditations where Descartes describes the features of the piece of wax is a vivid portrayal of a philosopher's thought process as he muses over an object he perhaps is holding on with his fingers. Let's begin with this. Let us consider those things which are commonly thought to be more distinctly grasped than anything else. I mean the bodies we touch and see, but not bodies in general, for these general perceptions are usually considerably more confused, but one body in particular. Let us, for example, take this wax. It has not only just been removed from the honeycomb, it has not yet lost all the flavor of its honey. It retains some of the scent of the flowers among which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are clearly visible. It is hard, cold, easy to touch, and if you tap it with your knuckle, it makes a sound. In short, it has all the properties that seem to be required for a given body to be known as distinctly as possible. The piece of wax seems to have all the properties that Descartes describes as he turns it over his hand. Since it is a small, easily scrutinized object, it is as clearly and distinctly perceived as any physical entity we might imagine. We cannot only see its color, shape, and so on, just as Descartes says, but he brings it to life as we read about its flavor of honey and smell of blossoms, texture and temperature, and even the sound it makes. If we cannot reach clarity about the physical properties of such an immediately perceivable object, then we cannot hope to focus our senses more concentratedly on any other more elusive and questionable object of experience. In short, what Descartes is doing is, after he has proven his existence as a thinking thing, he's now trying to provide evidence for the existence of all the rest other than himself. And for that matter, it's not easy to make that jump, right? That to a certain extent, he's sure about himself, but about the world, he's not yet sure. Descartes, therefore, quickly shifts to a consideration of what happens to the wax when it is heated behind melting point, and changes all the properties as previously listed as belonging to it. We can easily perform the experiment ourselves with little trouble if we can only find an ordinary piece of wax. In the church, for sure, there are. That's why Descartes would say, here, but wait, he says. While I am speaking, it is brought close to the fire. The remains of its flavor evaporate, the smell fades, the color is changed, the shape is taken away, it grows in size, because becomes liquid, becomes warm. It can hardly be touched, and now if you strike it, it will give off no sound. Does the same wax remain? Interesting question, right? With all the properties changed, removed, does it remain the same wax? We must admit it does remain, he says. No one would say or think it does not. So what was there in it that was so distinctly grasped? Certainly none of the qualities I apprehended by the senses. For whatever came under taste, or smell, or sight, or touch, or hearing has now changed, but the wax remains. Descartes draws several important conclusions about the wax as it is transformed by its proximity to the fire. His interest in the problem of change and in what Aristotle would call an alteration in a primary substance is clearly related to what we have previously discussed as the main underlying problem of Aristotle's philosophy. It should come as no surprise then that Descartes turns to the same subject in his meditations on first philosophy. Although in broad outline, and despite other significant disagreements with Aristotle's metaphysics, Descartes appears at least to accept Aristotle's concept of primary substance and the distinction between essential and accidental properties. He differs from Aristotle also in his theory of the requirements under which the properties of the objects can be known. Descartes maintains that when the wax changes all its immediately perceptible properties, the wax, as Aristotle would also undoubtedly agree, persists through the accidental changes of its original color, shape, size, texture, odor, taste, and sound. Descartes appeals to common sense in arguing that no one denies the wax survives these presumably accidental changes, that in fact no one does not, one would say or think. So that's why he says there, we must admit here, it does remain. No one would say or think it does not. The question Descartes raises that does not seem to have occurred to Aristotle is how or why we believe that it is the very same piece of wax that undergoes these changes. He assumes that there are only three possibilities and he eliminates two of them, leaving only the third. The choices are that the wax is determined to be the same either by the senses, imagination, or by the judgment of mind, which is to say, by reason. Sensation is ruled out by Descartes when he argues that there is no single continuously sensible property of the piece of wax that is experienced before and after the change brought about by the proximity to the fire. None of it remains, as he said here in what we have just cited. He even cited the senses here in this part, right? Taste, smell, sight, touch, hearing. Those are the five senses. The color, the taste, shape, size, odor, so on, everything he posits as having been altered. So we cannot appeal to these perceptible properties as evidence that it is the same piece of wax that has undergone a series of accidental changes. Imagination is also ruled out by Descartes on the grounds that we understand that the wax is capable of undergoing indefinitely many more changes than we are capable of imagining. If it is not through sensation or imagination that we believe the wax to remain the same through its changes of state, but we are correct in thinking that the original piece is not replaced by another piece of wax with totally different perceptible properties, then, as Descartes argues, we can only arrive at the belief that the wax persists as the same thing through the alteration of all of its perceptible properties as a conclusion of reason or judgment of mind. That's why he will say, so there, that's the imagining part. That's why he would say, let me just look for the quote. Just a minute, sorry. Because this is a very long, he has so many things saying here, and it's very important that you pay attention also on how he changed. Of course, I'm not reading it already page per page, but the requirement is that you should be reading it page by page, right? Okay, sorry, I went beyond here from. Let's read that. From these, I would have immediately concluded that I therefore knew the wax by the sight of my eyes, not by the inspection of the mind alone. If I had not happened to glance out of the window at people walking along the street, using the customary expression, I say that I see them just as I see the wax. But what do I actually see other than hats and coats, which could be covering automata, self-automatic, right? Self-moving. But I judge that they are people, and therefore what I thought I saw with my eyes, I in fact grasp only by the faculty of judging that is in my eyes, or that is in my mind. Or we can read even before that, higher. For although I am considering all this myself silently and without speech, yet I am still ensnared by the words themselves, and but deceived by the very ways in which we usually put things. For we say that we see the wax itself, if it is present, not that we judge it to have been there on the basis of its color and shape. From these, I would have immediately concluded that I therefore knew the wax by the sight of my eyes, not by the inspection of the mind alone, if I have not happened to glance out on the window at people walking at the street. And you can continue until the end. What follows from the fact that we know the wax persists through changes of all its perceptible properties is also something very interesting. Can we really know the, the wax by means of the inspection of the mind alone? By this, Descartes must mean a faculty of reason or rational intuition or reflection other than ordinary sensation or imagination. There is something worthwhile to be learned, Descartes thinks, from the fact that the piece of wax is better known by mind than by perception. What follows from the fact that we know the wax persists through changes of all its perceptible properties is that the mind knows itself even more certainly than it knows anything whatsoever about the wax. By implication, then, the mind knows itself more truly and with greater certainty than it knows anything about any other perceivable thing external to the mind. The conclusion is a further inference of the evil demon hypothesis that casts doubt on belief in the existence of the wax or any perceivable object, and the cogito sum, by which the existence of the mind, self, or soul remains indubitable, in spite of the imaginable deceptions of hypothetical evil demon. And that's also interesting, right? Um, there's a very long quote that's also very interesting. Let me, it begins here actually. So let's read that. But one who desires to know more than the common herd, no, common herd, the hoi polloi in Greek, might be ashamed to have gone to the speech of the common herd to find a reason for doubting. Let us then go on where we left off by considering whether I perceived more perfectly and more evidently what the wax was when I first encountered it, and believed that I knew it by these external senses, or at least by what they call the common sense. That is, the imaginative power of whether I perceive it better now after I have more carefully investigated both what it is and how it is known. Certainly, it would be foolish to doubt that I have a much better grasp of it now. For what, if anything, was distinct in my original perception? What was there, if anything, that seemed to go beyond the perceptions of the lowest animals? But on the other hand, when I distinguish the wax from its external forms, and as if I have stripped of its garment, consider it in all its nakedness, then indeed, although there may still be error in my judgments, I cannot perceive it in this way except by the human mind. Uh, let's continue. It's a long quote. But what then shall I say about this mind or about myself? For I do not yet accept that there is anything in me but a mind. What I say, am I who seem to perceive this wax so distinctly? Do I not know myself not only much more truly, much more certainly, but also much more distinctly and evidently than the wax? For if I judge that the wax exists for the reason that I see it, it is certainly much more evident that I myself also exist from the very fact that I am seeing it. For it could be the case that what I am seeing is not really wax. It could be the wax that I do not even have the eyes with which to see anything, but it certainly cannot be the case when I see something or when I think I am seeing something. That I myself who think should not be something. By the same token, if I judge the wax exists for the reason that I am touching it, the same consequence follows, namely that I exist. If I judge it exists for this reason I am imagining it, or for any other reason, again, the same certainty applies. But what I have realized in the case of the wax, I can apply to anything that exists outside myself. Moreover, if the perception of the wax appears more distinct after it became known to me from many sources and not from sight or touch alone, how much more distinctly it must be admitted, I now know myself. I now know myself. Um, Interesting. I must know myself. Let's continue. For there are reasons that can enhance the perception either of the wax or of any other body at all that do not at the same time prove better to me the nature of my own mind. But there are so many things beside in the mind itself that can serve to make the knowledge of its more distinct that there seems scarcely any point in listing all the perceptions that flow into it from the body. Descartes, in fact, summarizes the moral of the piece of wax story in one paragraph. Uh, and it is this last paragraph that he concludes meditations to with. He says, but I see now that without realizing it, I've ended up where I wanted to be. For since I have now learned that bodies themselves are perceived not, strictly speaking, by the senses or by the imaginative faculty, but by the intellect alone, and that they are not perceived because they are touched or seen, but only because they are understood, I clearly realize that nothing can be perceived by me more easily or more clearly than my own mind. But since a long held opinion is a habit that cannot so readily be laid aside, I intend to stop here for a while in order to fix this newly acquired knowledge more deeply in my memory by long meditation. Let's reflect on that a little bit further. No? What is Descartes really trying to lead us to here? And how should we understand the piece of wax example of Descartes? There's no need to comment. I'm just asking you to think about it. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to send me a mail. I'll remind you. If it's not clear, please listen to it again. If it's clear, then click next and you can go to the next section. Thank you.